So one of our big things we're thinking about when we're coming in for treatment is we're thinking, do I have pain? Well, if that's the case, obviously we want to get out of pain. Another thing you may be thinking about is range of motion, my ability to go into certain movements to handle, to do functionally the things I want to do. But also we're obviously thinking about strength. We want to make sure functionally we're strong and able to do the things with my muscles and joints. And this is where some people have questions early on. They're saying, all right, here's my weaker side over here that we tested out and played with. You're telling me that we're trying to even strengthen me by working the other one at this point. And you may say, how does that make sense? Because I know if I don't use this thing over here, it's just going to get atrophied over time and just get weaker, right? So if I only work this side, or these muscles are going to get humongous and this guy actually gets smaller. And what we're actually going to teach you here is that's actually not at all what occurs. But in order to really understand that, you have to back up a little bit on exercise physiology and understand why functionally are you weak on this side. Well, one thing you need to know is when something, it's a bone shifting out of whack, or a muscle tightening up into that injury, or maybe it's a disc pulling on over there, as the body senses that there's an injury over here, one of the things it's going to do is tighten, again, those muscles up and those joints up as part of that injury. Now, in order to get actually a muscle, we call it firing, to get electricity where the brain and spinal cord sends a message to say, contract me, one of the things we need is to have something in what we call this, one of the nerve endings. In anatomy class, we call it a muscle spindle. We need this guy to be activated and very much helping our cause out here. Now, the way you get a muscle spindle activated is you need the two bones that attach to the muscle to have a nice ability to have a large range of motion in order to pull that off. So let's say I'm a baseball pitcher and I have a wind-up that's only like this big, and we're trying to get activated, let's say my pec muscles or tummy muscles here. We're trying to get these guys to work so I can have a really nice looking throw. Well, if I have a really big wind-up where I can reach that ball way back there, what happens when a muscle gets stretched out like that, it's the stretch itself stimulates that nerve ending called the muscle spindle that says, let's send a truckload of electricity in that and say, boom, we're going to get a contraction on that. And there's also a second part of by getting that muscle have the ability to be nice and stretched out. There's like a rubber band effect. There's passive energy that happens because it's can stretch like that too. Way different than if you're only here. So we need, again, that bone to be able to move that muscle to have good flexibility in it and good alignment in it in order to activate the nerve ending to get these muscles to contract in and of themselves. So that's going to be first and foremost. If you have a joint, muscle and disc, or things we're talking about shifted over here, this side looks like the weaker side. What you're doing by working the other way is you're pulling those bones back into place, pulling that muscle tension off of that spot to where it's now aligned. We get the normal flexibility back, and also now we have the potential to use that muscle spindle even more. I'm going to tell you just a really quick story to illustrate this, but it'll hopefully help you to understand. But I remember this was probably about 2005. I was treating this guy who, not exaggerating, came in with a pec muscle like this big on his chest. The other one was literally half the size. And his whole goal, he said, my main thing is I go to the gym 80 times a day for the last several years, and I can never get this guy to fire to catch up to this thing here. And he says, why can't I get that exercise to work, and what are you going to do about it? Because I've tried everything on the planet to do so. Well, what I found out is that once I diagnosed him, I found out he had an old rib injury where he had hurt himself years ago, and now again, that got injured, it got tightened up. So now he couldn't again make that muscle move to activate that muscle spindle there. So what happened is when he was doing chest press or bench press or inclines, all this other stuff he was trying to do to get these muscles to work, because he couldn't move here, but he could move here, his shoulder muscles were massive, on this side. Actually, these muscles are bigger than these ones on the other arm there. So, but he was like, I know I got this, but it was easier for him to get the movement here because that's where he could move, and this is where he could not. So what I told this guy, I said, this may or may not make sense to you, but what I want you to do is I want you to go work out and you do your normal routine for the next 2 weeks only on your good arm, good chest. And then the last session before you come back to see me again, test out that arm again. And what he did is he did that, A couple weeks later, you came out and said, I'm noticing firing for the first time in years on this pec here. And I said, how is that working? I'm just working this good arm here. I'm working the good side of my torso. And essentially that's what we were doing. We were starting to restore the alignment of the bones, again, the normal length tension relationships of those muscles there. So now again, we could get that firing happen again. Now remember, just because we do a lot of exercise on one side doesn't mean you're not using those muscles the rest of the day. You're still living life, going around, lifting and bending and walking and doing your normal tasks. So your muscles aren't going to atrophy because you're still using them. But by biasing over here, we're trying to get that tension back to that normal stretch and get that alignment back to its normal alignment to once again start to restore the ability of things like that muscle spindle to work again. Now, if we take it one step even further, that tightness coming into that injured area too also means less circulation and blood flow coming into that area. Can't get nutrition to it. So once again, we find working that good side that we're talking about can get that tension off of that to allow for that neurological activation, but also allow for that circulatory thing. So while it's a common question we may get people early on, if I only work this side, isn't that only side going to get weaker? If I only work this side, aren't these muscles going to be humongous and these guys are going to waste away to nothing? We've never once over the last decades of doing this found that to be happening. If anything, actually, we see it the complete opposite. We see, again, we start to normalize out where these guys are catching up, and we see these guys get back to eventually, best case scenario, everything's aligned really well, nice and even, and you're seeing, again, I've got nothing restricting me here in tightness or weakness or range of motion, and everything's symmetrical on my two sides. Eventually, we want to get back to where you are working bilateral. The one-sided thing is not meant to be for the rest of your life. The one-sided thing right now is strictly to get us to restore back to that balance point, and then you go back to being just like everybody else who's not injured. So hopefully that helps you. Yeah, if you still have questions on that though, make sure you address that with your therapist.